So I run this platform called peacocking.pro where users can generate AI images of themselves. This is how the flow looks like. Once the user has signed in, they can go ahead and upload their images or zip to my backend. And once that is done, I send in this request to an external service, which then trains that AI model, which the user can use to generate their own photos. Now, the problem is once the user sends in the request, and I have uploaded the images and sent the request to the external server, how am I ever supposed to know that this external server has completed the task of training the model? Because training the model can actually take a very long time. It can probably take anywhere between 5 to 20 minutes. And before this, it could probably take more than 30 minutes. So what am I supposed to do in that case? Well, one approach is that I could constantly poll this external server for requests. That is, I can ask it, have you completed the task? Have you completed the task every 10 seconds or every whatever timer we set? And I'll only stop once I receive the status of actually the task being completed from the external server. And that is only and only when I stop. But the problem with this constant polling is that it's very resource intensive on our server. We're constantly requesting the external server for some resource, and that doesn't really make sense because it's very resource intensive, it's highly inefficient, and it increases the cost of running our server, right? Why would you want to do that? This is where webhooks come in. Now, on the client side, everything remains the same, right? The client will still be sending in this request normally, and I'll still be uploading it and then sending in the request to the external server for training. Now, the only difference is that now I've set up a webhook URL. That is a webhook endpoint on the external server. I've provided a webhook URL. Let's say an API endpoint, API webhook endpoint. For example, I've set up an API webhook endpoint, which I can use, which is the endpoint that my server also has, and I provide that URL to the external server. So now I don't need to worry about constantly asking the external server whether it has completed the task or not. It is now the responsibility of the external server to send in a post request to my public API after the completion of the task. And now then I can go ahead and process the data that it sends through to my server and then do whatever I want. For example, update my database and just do whatever I want with that data available to me now. So this is a very asynchronous method of actually going ahead and getting data from the external server. You'll hear a lot of people call webhooks as reverse APIs. It is because of here, unlike normal APIs where we are pulling data, we are actually waiting for data to be pushed onto a server from an external server rather than pulling data from anywhere. Now, this is just one example where I use webhooks. Webhooks are also used in multiple places. For example, GitHub Actions to trigger actions of deploying your application in Stripe or Razorpay or any other payment gateway when you want to receive events where your user has paid, because you don't want to rely on the client to actually send in that request to you, right? Even though Razorpay and Stripe return a payment URL back to you on the client, you don't want to rely on that. You actually want to rely on the service, that is Razorpay or Stripe directly, to send you events on your server. Now, another very, very, very important point to keep in mind is that because this API webhook endpoint, or this whatever this endpoint you name it, because it's a public URL, and if your app gets pretty big, then there's a very good chance that someone might figure out what this URL is and then just spam it. And now, because this is a public URL, they can just get whatever they want, right? They can get in whatever images they want, how many ever credits they want. They can do anything with their application after this. So that is why it is very important to set up a secret. It is very important for you to have a secret that is shared between you, that is the external provider, that the external server, and your own client. So whenever you receive any data from the external server, that has to be signed using the secret. And then you can verify whether the data is coming from the external server using that secret key. Now, the way that the secret key works is that it hashes the data and sends it to the endpoint. I'm not going to be discussing about hashes in this video because it will just elongate the video. And that's not the point of this video, right? Hashes is not the point. But if any of you are interested in knowing about hashes, just drop a comment and I'll I'll make a video on it, sure. So this is the first point to keep in mind, that you must always have a secret. Must have a secret key to protect your API, to protect your webhooks. The second point is that all your webhooks should be idempotent. That is, anytime you receive the same request or the same data from the external server, you don't repeat the action. That is, you don't process the data twice and update the database twice. For example, if the user has paid once, you don't want to update your server twice just because you received the webhook, the event twice on your server, right? So it's very important to have your webhooks be idempotent. You don't repeat anything. And the third thing, which will probably only concern you if you are dealing with very high traffic, is that it's very important to know that your webhooks can very easily get overwhelmed in high traffic situations. And that's why it's very important to maintain queues that then process the data using that queue. Because otherwise your webhook endpoint might be toasted and the external server will keep on sending requests and you might not be able to process them. So you'll miss out on a lot of events. So that's why it's very important to have a queue or some sort of mechanism where you store all the requests and then process them one by one. Or just use a serverless environment like Vessel and scale to infinity. And yeah, then you're good to go. Alright, that was about webhooks in general. One con that I wanted to share with you about webhooks is that you cannot rely on webhooks 100% because sometimes it might happen that the external server did not send the right data to your webhook, or probably your webhook endpoint itself is down, or whatever reason. So it's very important to also have some sort of fallback mechanism present in an application where you are probably checking the request using some sort of API that the external server has provided you or the external service has provided you. And yeah, just have some sort of fallback whenever you're dealing with webhooks, because it might happen that your webhook is down and or probably the external server is not able to process and send the request to your webhook, whatever the case is. It's very important to have a backup. And yeah, that's about this video. I hope you learn a lot about webhooks in this video and how I use them currently inside Peacocking. Yeah, I'd also urge you to try Peacocking.pro. It's only $10 and it can generate some absolutely mind-blowing photos. Yeah, that's been all from my side. See you later.